Scarlet and Violet's first DLC, the Teal Mask, was released recently, and there are a bunch of older Pokemon that received pretty major buffs. In order to make sure that this video isn't too long, I went through all of the changes and singled out the ones that I thought were the most impactful and the most important. So if there's something that you noticed that I didn't, that's totally possible. These are just the ones that I thought were the most important. Let's start off with one of the bigger ones, Empoleon. Now, Empoleon has never been a good Pokemon, though it did win the World Championships back in, I think, 2009, but it's overall not a great Pokemon. Water and Steel is a good defensive typing, but its stats are kind of mediocre, and its ability Defiant, while good, it was not great because Empoleon likes to be a special attacker, which is why it's kind of a big deal that now Empoleon's hidden ability was changed from Defiant to Competitive. This might seem like a small change because both abilities kind of do the same thing, where if a stat is dropped, they get a +2 buff and an offensive stat, but it's actually a pretty major deal. Empoleon's special attack stat is a lot higher than its attack stat, and so this means that if you don't get the boost from an Intimidate from your opponent or an Icy Wind or some kind of stat lowering, Empoleon's a lot stronger as a special attacker compared to being a physical attacker. Importantly, the most common ways that opponents will lower your stats is the Intimidate ability, which, you know, it still activates Defiant and you still end up with a +1 attack boost, but if it activates a competitive Pokemon, that boost is +2, which is a lot more impactful. Overall, I don't think this is going to make Empoleon like the most common Pokemon of all time, but I do think that it allows it to go from virtually no usage after 2009 to at least possibly being worth considered, if not in this game, then at least in future games. But Empoleon isn't the only Sinnoh starter to receive a pretty major buff. Torterra, a Pokemon that I think has almost no competitive play, so much so that as a fun fact, there was actually a time in 2015 where players were considering using Grotle instead of Torterra. But yeah, Torterra's basically never been used before competitively, and while I don't think it'll be the most popular Pokemon, it did receive two pretty major buffs. The first is the attack Shell Smash, which at the cost of one stage of your defense and special defense, doubles your speed, special attack, and attack stats. This move is especially good on Torterra because although it does lower its defenses are actually relatively high, and its speed and its offenses are the thing that lacks a little bit. So I think it's actually a pretty good trade-off, especially if you're holding an item like the White Herb, which allows you to negate negative stat drops. So overall, I think this is a really interesting change, and I think that it could allow Torterra to at least have some niche uses. On top of that, Torterra also got access to the move Grassy Glide, which I don't believe it ever had access to before. Grassy Glide did receive a pretty major nerf, down from 70 base power to 55, but this is still a good move, and in grassy terrain, it is a priority attack. I don't know if you really want to pair it with Rillaboom, but like maybe you could run an Assault Vest set and you could have both Woodhammer and Grassy Glide in case your opponent sets up terrain. It's at least worth considering in my opinion, so it certainly doesn't hurt. This next Pokemon is another Pokemon that received an ability change, and from what I can tell, it's one that people are very, very excited about. Shiftry, a Pokemon that hasn't been good since 2010 probably, has received a pretty major buff, which is that one of its abilities, Early Bird, which is not a super useful ability between you and me, has been changed to the very powerful ability Wind Rider. Wind Rider is like maybe one of the most broken abilities ever created. It's so good, in fact, that Bramblegast, a Pokemon with very little going for it, was able to top cut the World Championships this year, despite having a lot of really powerful Pokemon like Urshifu and Landorus and Heatran, etc., pretty much off the back of this ability. If you're not aware of how it works, basically this ability makes you immune to all wind category moves. That means like Heat Wave and Icy Wind and Bleak Wind Storm, and I think maybe even Blizzard. There's a lot of moves that you're immune to, and not only are you immune to them, but if you ever get hit by one, you get an attack boost. On top of that, if Tailwind is set up, you also get an attack boost, or if you switch in and Tailwind is already up on your side, you also get an attack boost. Now, Shiftry doesn't have that much going for it, in large part because its defensive typing is bad and its stats are also not that great, but given access to this ability, I think it's actually legitimate. It already has access to Fake Out, it has a number of decent moves like Leaf Blade and Knock Off, and a bunch of other interesting moves as well, Swords Dance, Taunt, etc. Sucker Punch for priority, and I think it gets Grassy Glide, and Explosion if you want to go boom. It has a lot that it can do, but with a Focus Sash and a move pool of like Fake Out, Knock Off, Leaf Blade, and I don't know, Sucker Punch or Protect or something, I think that it could actually be pretty strong. I mean, we saw Bramblegast do very well at this World Championship despite not having as much going for it. I think its attack set is a bit higher, but yeah, I mean, Shiftry is a like meaningfully better support move pool, whereas Bramblegast is pretty narrow. The really nice thing is if you ever switch it in on a wind type move like Heat Wave or Icy Wind, which are relatively common, you immediately get the attack boost, and if it's in Tailwind, That means you get 2 attack boosts in a single turn. I mean, it's a really broken ability, and while Shiftry isn't a good Pokemon without it by any means, I think it's worth considering, especially since it has Fake Out. That's a really big deal. It takes Shiftry from being completely irrelevant to actually maybe having a niche. I don't think it's going to be meta like like similar to the other Pokemon, but I do think it will get some usage. So we'll have to see how this thing does. Before we continue with the video, I want to take a second to just let you all know that I actually started a Patreon recently where I'm offering a lot of competitive, educational, and entertaining content. There's multiple bonus videos per month, as well as the ability to submit your teams for review and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. I don't want to take too much time, so you can check it all out yourself at patreon.com/WolfeyVGC, but I feel really good about the value that we're providing. So if you want more educational or entertaining content, recommend you at least check out the different tiers. That covers the ability changes and the kind of major buffs. The rest of these will have a slightly lower impact, but I think they're still relevant. Starting with Rillaboom, who has once again been given Grassy Glide. For anyone unaware, Grassy Glide is a lower base power move that has priority, but only if grassy terrain is active. And since Rillaboom's Grassy Surge ability automatically sets up grassy terrain, it's a good combo, right? Rillaboom basically sets up its own priority enabling terrain, which also boosts the power by virtue of being a grass move. This used to be 70 base power, which was absurd. It was incredibly powerful, and they have nerfed it not to 65, not to 60, but to 55, which this is a substantial nerf. However, this is still a very powerful Pokemon, and I still think that Rillaboom with Grassy Glide is a massive deal that you should almost always be using. The thing about Grassy Glide back in Gen 8 was it was actually useful as like a KO move. Like you could run Choice Band Grassy Glide and you would be doing enormous amounts of damage to a lot of Pokemon in the format. You're probably not going to be getting so many one-hit KOs anymore. With Choice Band, you can probably pick up stuff like Flutter Mane and Urshifu Water, but you're not going to be doing as like intense damage, but I think that that's okay. Yeah, sometimes you want to be doing big damage with the Grassy Glide, but it's mostly there to combo with your faster teammates and to pick off like Focus Sash Pokemon and stuff like that and low HP targets. Grassy Glide still functions basically the same. I mean, the threshold of how low the opponent has to be for you to KO them is different, but the fundamentals are the same. I mean, Rillaboom almost won the World Championships without Grassy Glide, and I also don't think that there's that high of an opportunity cost for running Grassy Glide on Rillaboom. You can still run on like an Assault Vest set, Fake Out, Woodhammer, Grassy Glide, and U-Turn or a coverage move. Yeah, I don't actually think it's that like troublesome to fit on Rillaboom, and on Choice Band, you obviously want Grassy Glide anyway, and you also don't need to run Fake Out, right? You run U-Turn, Woodhammer, Grassy Glide, and then either Stomping Tantrum or Low Kick or Knockoff or something. So yeah, I think that overall this is a huge buff for Rillaboom. It's not a new buff, but it is new given Scarlet and Violet. So next up we have Scizor. Now Scizor isn't like a super meta relevant Pokemon, but it did get access to 3 new moves, which I think are all somewhat relevant. The first is Knockoff. Knockoff, just a great utility move. It's really nice because like if your opponent is anticipating a super effective move, you can hit them with a Knockoff, take away their item, very useful. It also gets Bug Bite, which is a big deal because of Scizor's ability Technician, which means if a move is under 60 base power, it will be powered up to 90 base power. Bug Bite isn't normally used because 60 base power is really low, but with Technician, it's 90 base power. It's stronger than like X-Scizor and U-Turn. So on the whole, this is actually a pretty nice move for Scizor if you want a bug type attack, especially because Bug Bite eats berries, and that's pretty useful. Eating a citrus berry or removing a resist berry, those are useful things. Scizor is definitely not upset to have access to that. The last move that I want to talk about on Scizor is Dual Wingbeat, which is a 40 base power move that hits twice. So it's basically 80 base power, but each of those 40 base power hits gets powered up by Technician. So this basically goes from an 80 base power move to a 120 base power move, which is a meaningful increase. Like, I mean, that's a pretty strong attack. If you wanted to use Terra Flying Dual Wingbeat, you could probably do some pretty serious damage, especially with a boosting item. I don't think that Scizor really has that much room to run Dual Wingbeat. This might actually be worth some consideration because with Bullet Punch, positive matchup into Chenpao and Flutter Mane, with Dual Wingbeat, you're good into Ogerpon as well. I mean, Scizor, unless it's the fire type one, you have positive matchup into the grass types like Rillaboom and Amoonguss, and also the fighting types like Urshifu and Urshifu. There's a lot of things that Scizor can hit for super effective damage. I don't necessarily think it's going to be meta, but these are nice tools, and on the right team, I think that like the right player can appreciate having a couple more options here. We should also talk about Scyther. Scyther also gets Dual Wingbeat. This is more meaningful in Scyther than Scizor because Scizor isn't a flying type, so it isn't as powerful. Eviolite Scyther is faster than Scizor. It's not a better Pokemon. I don't think its matchup spread is better either, but it has been used before. It could be used again. It's relatively fast. Bug and Flying, having a 4 times grass resist is going to be nice in case Ogerpon becomes, especially in its grass form, popular. And yeah, Dual Wingbeat is very good on Scyther. It can probably do some pretty serious damage to Pokemon that are weak to flying. Also, Scyther outspeeds Urshifu, so it actually ends up being a pretty interesting choice. As long as we're talking about it, let's talk about Kleavor. Kleavor doesn't have Technician and it isn't a flying type Pokemon. Dual Wingbeat isn't super relevant on it, though it does learn it, but it's a lot weaker. I mean, Scyther gets both Technician and Stab, and Scizor gets Technician. Kleavor gets neither. But Kleavor gets something else that I think is worth mentioning, which is Lunge, which is a relatively powerful bug type attack. And because Kleavor has Sharpness and not Technician, while Scyther and Scizor would prefer to run Bug Bite because that's a weaker move that actually becomes stronger thanks to Technician, Kleavor doesn't have a bug type move that's powered up by Sharpness, and so it's been running X-Scissor, which for whatever reason isn't powered up by Sharpness. Lunge is a better secondary effect. It's a cool Pokemon. Its signature move Stone Axe is really strong, and I think that this is like not a big buff, but a buff nonetheless. Okay, let's talk about another one that seems to be pretty popular that people are talking about, and that is Tyranitar, who now gets access to Knockoff. Tyranitar typically runs Crunch, which is just like a solid dark type attack. Knockoff is pretty much strictly better. Again, removing your opponent's items is like a massive deal, and especially because Tyranitar is already kind of difficult to switch into. Dark is a good offensive type, not perfect, but good. Tyranitar, to my knowledge, has never had access to Knockoff before, and it's still typically been a pretty good Pokemon. Yeah, I do think that this is a pretty non-trivial change, to say the least. This next one's a bit smaller, but I think it's worth mentioning. Como-O gets access to Vacuum Wave now, which is a priority 100% accurate fighting type move, which I personally think is interesting. Como-O kind of hasn't really seen success since the early days of Sun and Moon, and I think Dynamax is in part to blame for that, and I think its typing is also in part to blame for that. So now, when there's no Dynamax and Como-O can change its typing, I think it could actually be good. It has a really interesting move in Clangorous Soul. Basically, getting access to a fighting move that hits first and is a special attack. These are pretty important things. So again, I don't even think it'll be on every Como-O, but I do think that it's a non-trivial buff. So I'm excited to see if Como-O has some play this season. Next up, let's talk about a new Pokemon introduced in Scarlet and Violet, which had some success, but hasn't really been as popular as of late, though it has a lot going for it. And that is Baxcalibur. Baxcalibur getting a couple of new moves that are relevant. The first being high horsepower. Baxcalibur had for a while been running Earthquake, even with Terra Ground Earthquake, but with the introduction of Rillaboom, it didn't really run Earthquake anymore. And so high horsepower is like a better single target ground type attack that doesn't hit your partner and also isn't, weakened by Grassy terrain. The other one is interesting though. The other one is Scale Shot. Now, Scale Shot is a multi-hit dragon type move that at the end of it raises your speed by 1 and lowers your defense by 1. Baxcalibur has already run a set before with Loaded Dice, where Loaded Dice allows Icicle Spear to hit 4 at least times, maybe 5, and this also works with Scale Shot. Basically, if you run Loaded Dice, you can run Icicle Spear and Scale Shot, and that means that they will always hit 4 to 5 times, meaning your base power is at least 100 on both of them. I think Baxcalibur can have a resurgence with this. I think like Protect, Scale Shot, Icicle Spear, and one more, maybe High Horsepower, maybe Swords Dance, I don't know, maybe Ice Shard. I think this could definitely see some play, especially with Alolan Ninetales coming back and being a better like snow setter than Abomasnow. This one's really quick. Scald is returned in the DLC, but the distribution is extremely limited. My friends Politoed and Ludicolo both do not get it. So just a quick note here, the Pokemon that I think are most relevant with Scald are Slowbro, Slowking, Milotic, and to a certain extent Goodra. None of these are super impactful, I think, but like Scald is a really broken move, so I don't think we'll be seeing a ton of Slowbro or Slowking. Milotic, I do think we'll be seeing some play. It is a pretty massive buff that in a generation where Scald was removed, these Pokemon still learn it. Goodra less so, but Goodra's special bulk on both Goodra's special bulk is pretty high, and so having a move that can burn is not irrelevant by any means. And again, Scald is just a broken move. So primarily this is a Milotic, Slowbro, Slowking buff, and partially this is a Goodra buff. This next one's a little more niche, and I think a lot of people aren't going to see the vision with it, but I think that it's very interesting, and that is that Gallade, a Pokemon which has not seen really any usage, was given access to the new TM Solar Blade. Now, Solar Blade is a really powerful attack. However, it's especially relevant on Gallade because Gallade has the ability Sharpness, which actually powers up Solar Blade even further. You could have a Trick Room team where you have like Gallade and something that helps to Trick Room up, and then like Torkoal, like Gallade, Mousehold, and like where the plan is, follow me, let Mousehold go down, Gallade sets up Trick Room, and then Torkoal comes in, and all of a sudden you have a very strong fire type attack, which spread damage and is very powerful. The only Pokemon that like to switch into fire attacks are fire types, but then water and rock types, both of whom are hit by super effective with Solar Blade. So yeah, I think that this is actually really interesting. Gallade pairs really well with Torkoal because it hits Heatran, typically is a pretty big problem for Torkoal. So yeah, on the whole, I think that this is very interesting, and like I don't think Gallade will be meta, but I do think that this is a meaningful buff. You don't even need Trick Room. Like maybe you have Scarf Gallade with Torkoal and like Lilligant and some other stuff. I don't fully have this figured out, but I do think that Gallade with Solar Blade, and if you gave it like a Choice Band or a Life Orb or anything that boosted that even further, or Terra Grass, I bet the damage output is just absurd, to be honest. This next one's pretty minor. Kilowattrel gets access to Weather Ball. Kilowattrel's not a very good Pokemon. It's unfortunately just a little bit too slow to outspeed like the really fast Pokemon. I do think that like in certain metas, there's a case for it to be used like on a rain team specifically. So you can run Hurricane and Thunder and maybe Tailwind. Now you can run Weather Ball as well. So you can run Thunder, Hurricane, Weather Ball. You could run it like with choice specs or whatever. I don't think this is going to be relevant in the current format, but I wanted to mention it in case we ever are playing a format with Kilowattrel where the power level is lower. Like Politoed Kilowattrel, if it was like the fastest thing in the format where you could go Helping Hand and like Volt Switch, Thunder, Hurricane, or Weather Ball, that sounds really strong to me. So again, probably not super relevant in this format, but I thought it was worth mentioning nonetheless. Hey, just a quick reminder, most of my audience actually isn't subscribed to the channel at the moment. So if you're enjoying the content and you want more entertaining or educational content, maybe just see if you're subscribed. Helps the channel out a lot. And yeah, if you like the content, you might want to subscribe. Back to the rest of it. Another minor thing, Talonflame now gets dual Wingbeat. This is another thing which is going to be more relevant in a lower power level format. There isn't that much reason to use Talonflame now that Tornadus is back because it's kind of just strictly better, but dual Wingbeat is nice because Gale Wings only works as Talonflame's ability when Talonflame is at full HP. So Brave Bird, which is the typical move you run on Talonflame, automatically takes away that priority from it. And so the fact that Talonflame gets dual Wingbeat means that you don't lose the Gale Wings by just attacking. I still don't think it's that big a deal, to be honest. I think you still probably prefer Brave Bird, but I thought it was worth mentioning nonetheless. This next one I think is actually interesting and has potential, and that is Ceruledge now gets access to Poltergeist. Poltergeist is an absurdly powerful move that does a ton of damage, and previously Ceruledge's best ghost type attack I think was like Shadow Claw, and Poltergeist is a lot better. So an Assault Vest set with like Bitter Blade, Shadow Sneak, Poltergeist, and Terra Blast I think is actually pretty powerful, to be honest, especially, yeah, because Poltergeist is so strong and Ceruledge with an Assault Vest doesn't necessarily like rely on it. I don't know how well Ceruledge can keep up in like the current format, but I think with Ogerpon being introduced, which, you know, in theory can run either pure grass or grass and fire, Ceruledge is a really strong matchup into both of those typings. So if that becomes popular, then I think we could see some play there. I also just think it's a good Pokemon. I don't think it's broken by any means. I think it certainly has some issues, but I don't know. I think that there's some interesting things about it. And yeah, I always like Ceruledge. And although it didn't have like a super strong performance in recent months, I do think that it has potential and that it has a lot going for it. So I think that this is a meaningful buff that could actually result in it seeing a little more play. Next up, we have a Pokemon that I've kind of mentioned already, which is Brambleghast. It also gets Poltergeist, as well as getting access to Grassy Glide. Now, Poltergeist here is a bigger deal than Grassy Glide. Previously, Brambleghast had been running Terra Blast with Terra Ghost because it doesn't get a good one-turn ghost type attack. And so getting access to Poltergeist, pretty major deal. Grassy Glide, not so much. Grassy Glide, because it needs to be with Rillaboom, and like you are almost never going to be bringing Rillaboom with your own Brambleghast because of the typing overlap, because Brambleghast wants to be used in Tailwind, whereas Rillaboom is a bit bulkier. Doesn't make a ton of sense in my opinion. However, I still wanted to mention it because it is a good move, and in certain metas, it might be a big deal, but mostly here, this is Poltergeist, which gives Brambleghast for the first time an actual usable ghost type move. Speaking of grass types, this one doesn't get Grassy Glide, but it does get Lash Out, and that is Brute Bonnet. This isn't like a huge deal. Brute Bonnet, kind of disappointing in all honesty. I initially thought it was going to be a lot better, but you need a good reason to run it over Amoonguss, and Amoonguss is so strong. So yeah, Brute Bonnet not looking super good, but Lash Out is a really good move. This one increases in power if any of your stats were lowered on this turn. It's a really good, like, for Pokemon that don't want to run Clear Amulet but are susceptible to Intimidate, and Brute Bonnet meets those criteria. So I think that it's a strong Pokemon. I think it's a strong move. I don't think it's going to be a huge deal because Brute Bonnet hasn't been looking very good, but might be worth considering if nothing else, and it's at least a buff, you know? Pokemon that didn't really need a buff that also got Lash Out is Chen Pao, one of the strongest, probably the strongest Treasure of Ruin, and one of the strongest new Pokemon introduced in Scarlet and Violet. This is a pretty big deal. Chen Pao, when it wants to run a dark move, will often run Crunch or Throat Chop. Neither of those moves are super good in the current meta. They're basically like Crunch can drop defense, which is nice, and then Throat Chop shuts down moves, but like none of the moves are really used right now, so it's kind of irrelevant. So Crunch is typically the favored one. Lash Out is a lot better in my opinion. It's not quite as strong as Crunch or Throat Chop, but being able to double in power if you're intimidated is a pretty massive deal because it can put your opponent in situations where it's like, oh, if I lower the stat to weaken the ice move, I might end up eating a double power Lash Out this turn, which is actually stronger than Icicle Crash or Ice Spinner. So I think that Chen Pao, if they want to run Crunch, they'll probably switch to Lash Out. So yeah, pretty big deal there. Just a couple more here. Our penultimate one I want to talk about is Ting-Lu. Ting-Lu is not looking super strong in the current formats. Ever since the power level jumped up again with the introduction of Urshifu and Rillaboom, Ting-Lu is kind of missing out. It does also get Lash Out, and previously its best Dark type move was Throat Chop. Ting-Lu also has the benefit of Lash Out in the sense that it's very slow, and so it's often attacking after the opponent. So whereas Chen Pao pretty much is only going to be activating Lash Out for the most part off of like Intimidate drops. Ting Lu can also activate it on Icy Wind and other stat drops as well, like Parting Shot, for example. I don't think this takes Ting Lu back into viability, like, or at least not into common usage, but it is a buff. And if you ever want to run a dark move on Ting Lu, you now have a better option. Last but not least is Roaring Moon, which is commonly referred to within the community as Roaring Mid because it kind of struggles to get results despite the fact that it on paper looks incredibly powerful. It gets 2 new moves, which are a pretty big deal. Maybe actually 3 new moves that are a pretty big deal. The first is Lash Out. We've talked about why this is good. This is good counterplay against Intimidate. The second one is probably the dark move that it will prefer to use though. Although it already gets Crunch and Throat Chop and actually Jaw Lock, which are 3 dark type moves which all have different benefit. It now also gets access to Knock Off, which incredibly powerful dark type move, which is actually stronger than the others if the opponent is holding an item. Roaring Moon is a physical attacker, so it is susceptible to Intimidate, but I think that Knockoff is better because it's stronger when not intimidated, and it also is like has just a more useful secondary effect. Speaking of which, very glad that Chen Pao did not get Knockoff because that would be a problem to say the least. The last move that Roaring Mid gets access to that I think is actually interesting, if nothing else, is Scale Shot, which again lowers defense but raises speed. Previously, if Roaring Moon wanted a speed boost, it would run Tailwind or Dragon Dance, and this allows it to get that speed boost while actually still exerting offensive pressure. We've never really seen Scale Shot do super well in the past, so it's hard to say like how big of a buff this is, but it is definitely a buff, and I think that it will probably be used on Roaring Moon, especially because the Dragon move it would use before is like maybe Breaking Swipe, and so that's not super useful, I guess, just because Dragon Claw didn't feel worth it a lot of the time. So this can now allow you to get that speed boost without needing to not do damage in the same turn. And that's all the Pokemon that I identified as receiving meaningful buffs. I'm curious what you all think about this. If there's any Pokemon that stand out to you that you think are going to be really strong that maybe I undersold, if there's any Pokemon I oversold, let me know in the comments. And yeah, thanks for watching. Appreciate it. Bye bye.